Today I want to talk to you about something that really has a lot to do with real world bow hunting situations. You know, we watch on television, and I love watching a lot of the shows on the Outdoor Channel, Sportsman Channel. And I love seeing those big bucks come into a food plot, and they're playing around, they're feeding, and they're going slowly, and they're working around in the blind, and then it seems like it takes a minute to get in position and get the camera on it, and they zoom in and take the shot. Not the real world. It's not my world anyways. I'm in Southwest Wisconsin. I'm hunting in the woods. Over 95% of my top 25 mature bucks have been shot in the woods, not on a food plot. And I came up with something years ago, and you can look it up on Google even, an article that I entitled The 10-Second Bow Hunting Rule. And I think it's really important, and I'm going to flip back to that in a second, so I'll explain that. But one of the reasons this all started is because, you know, when you're trying to judge the age of a buck when it comes in, and you're looking at that buck, and there's characteristics of that buck that you can look at and try to get a decent age. Now, of course, the body, and looking at the body, where the neckline comes into the brisket, the back, the belly, the shoulders compared to the hindquarters, and the size, and how that buck physically looks, especially if it looks like a bull or not. You can tell the age of that buck, and guides, and I would say guides in Texas areas where they're sitting with a client and judging deer, they get really good at looking at those deer and figuring out exactly what age that is, and that's what they get paid to do. Really interesting study that the QDMA created several years ago was Dr. Mickey Hellickson down in Texas, and they had 5 biologists, and then they had the owner of the lab where you send your teeth into, your incisors, and they can actually look at those teeth and cut it open and figure out the age of that deer. I always thought they were really accurate. I knew jawbone aging wasn't that accurate, but they actually completed a study, and I have it here in my hand on my phone, and we'll put it there on the screen for you. But that same group of guys, and Dr. Mickey Hellickson, they had 5 wildlife biologists. They looked at bucks that were up to 9 or 10 years of age, and they were known age. They tagged them at birth. They were later shot by hunters. And so they did a pretty cool study of looking at the jawbone and looking at the teeth and figuring out exactly, you know, a guesstimate of what that age was. There were 263 bucks. So once those bucks were killed, they knew exactly the age. So they did a pretty cool study. What was interesting is when they sent those teeth into the lab, when they had that jawbone age, there was some similarly poor results in aging those deer. And I'm not trying to cut down that method. It's a scientific method that's used as a way of guesstimating age. Again, on the hoof, body, always the best. 4-year-old bucks, those 5 biologists, they were right 43% of the time on a 4-year-old buck, looking at a 4-year-old buck and saying, you know, that's a 4-year-old buck. 2.5-year-old bucks, they're actually right 79% of the time. 5-year-old bucks, the biologists were right 25% of the time, actually guesstimating age. So when you take your deer into the DNR check station, wherever you're at in your state, those aren't necessarily wildlife biologists that are paid to do this constantly and judge bucks and look at them and judge your age for a living. These biologists were, these in this area, they're only right 25% of the time. So when you bring a buck in to your local check station and they say that this is a 5 or 4 or 6-year-old, is it really? You know, even on a 5.5-year-old, they had a 25% chance. The lab is better, which you would expect, but on 4.5-year-old bucks, they're right 55% of the time. I was thinking over 90. On a 5.5-year-old buck, they're right 48% of the time. 6.5, they're right about 46% of the time. 6.5-year-old buck for the biologist in jawbone aging, they were correct roughly 18% of the time. And again, these are known age. The reason I say all this is you have a buck coming at you in the woods. I believe, and I wrote about a long time ago, and I analyzed all my bucks, that the majority, the vast majority, almost all of them, I'm getting less than 10 seconds to see that buck, identify that buck, age that buck, grab my bow, put my release on the string, pull back, and make the shot. Happened this morning. Had a buck come in, we had 5-6 seconds to look at it. I put my release on the string. I actually made the mistake, and I've shot a lot of mature bucks, but we all make mistakes. We all have a failure rate, right? So whatever mine is, I failed today, and what I did is I took my release off my string instead of pulling back. Wanted to take one more look at it through the oak leaves with the binoculars, and at that moment he was stepping into a shooting lane and moving, and he looked up at us, and I think he saw me putting my hand back towards the string loop with my release. Not really sure. It was really slight movements, and he was at 30 yards. But bottom line, whether I had pulled back on that buck or not, it was one that we have better bucks out here. It was one of those tweeners, which I would have been happy with. It's on the video. It's pretty nice buck. But bottom line is, boy, really a strong 6-7 seconds that I had to identify that buck and at least get my release on the string and pull back. And folks, in the real world hunting situations, that's what happens, where you get deceived sometimes by what goes on online and some of the television shows, which are awesome. I love watching them. But when it comes to hunting mature bucks in the woods, especially when they're cruising, it's November 2nd right now, you have a very short amount of time to judge them, age them, pull back, make a decision. Jawbone aging, of course, you can't do when it's on the hoof. You can't check their teeth. Can't send them into a lab when it's on the hoof. What you can, though, is look at the antlers. And now all these scientific pure types out there are going to say you can't judge a buck by the antlers, but you sure as heck can put it into a 1.5, 2.5, 3.5, 4.5 and older category. No, you're probably not going to be able to tell if it's a 4.5 or a 7.5 or a 5.5 and a 6.5. But you can put it into a shoot or not category pretty quick. When you watch the way that buck walks, his attitude, he's always going to walk stiffer, slower. A lot of times I see that those bucks are darker, their antlers are darker. I was told by John Azoga long ago, and I've held to this, that a buck that lives out in the open has white antlers. The sun bleaches antlers. That's why sheds are mostly all white, because they're exposed to the sun. They're laying on the ground, the leaves are gone. If that buck is living back in the shadows, in the dark, in the swamps, his antlers are darker, not because of what he rubs, but because it's just not simply sun exposed. The older bucks just simply aren't out in the open. A lot of times the coat is darker for that, and then those antlers are certainly darker for that. So attitude, antlers, that dark. Now if you can happen to notice its belly hanging, its back sagging, its neck going right into the brisket, that's all great. That'll help you further identify that. But again, going back to that 10-second rule, you don't have a lot of time. I further detail in that article that I wrote years ago, and you can check it out online. But 10-second bow hunting rule, think about that as that buck might be approaching. Think about those steps that you're going to take to make sure you get on that deer and get a successful shot off. And hopefully that'll end your season with success at the same time.